Welcome to another edition of Papa's Perspective, brought to you by Bob's Discount Furniture, the official furniture store and a mattress partner of the New York Giants. Well, the countdown to 100 has been released, and I put together this blue ribbon panel of voters, and one of them is Joe Horrigan, who has been with the Pro Football Hall of Fame since 1977. You've been around Hall of Fame voting. You've been around all this, and Joe was nice enough to dedicate his time in helping us identify the top 100 players. What was the biggest challenge for you, Joe, in this process?
Well, always when we're talking about team specific, I have to keep remembering that. When you start looking and you're saying, gosh, you only made two Pro Bowls or two All-Pro teams, but that's on a given team at a given position that may have been locked down by somebody, for outside of the team for a number of years. Like, I'm sure there were a lot of linebackers in the NFL that hated the annual All-Pro picks when Lawrence Taylor was playing because that was a slot gone. So you always got to remember that, and that's always a difficult thing when you're trying to apply apples to apples. There are a lot of, we see it all the time at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. You see guys that you would say, oh, he must have been a All-Pro, his entire career, and he was maybe twice because there was a guy named Joe Montana playing quarterback instead of bouncing someone like a John Elway out in the year when clearly he was a great quarterback. So that's the thing that I had to keep in mind all the time is got to remember apples to apples and who else was playing that position over the years, not just on that team, but outside that team to measure against.
Yeah, I think that's something why Carl Banks only made it to one Pro Bowl. He's got Lawrence Taylor being rubber stamp. Harry Carson had gone to, 10 straight. And I'm sure people had Giants fatigue. And of course, the Saints had some great linebackers at the time. But the Pro Football Hall of Fame recognized him as part of the all-decade team of the 80s as the second team. So
Yeah,
it kind of softens it.
yeah, you gotta wonder what does it take.
Right.
He was perhaps better at his position, that than many others at other positions that were slam dunks.
Right.
If the logic.
So, Joe, obviously comparing eras was another interesting component of this, but I want to focus in on some of the guys that are on this list that are in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Because, look, we don't need to discuss on this show Lawrence Taylor. We know where he stands in the lexicon. But, Roosevelt Brown finished number 2 in the voting. And I try to explain to fans that have questioned me via social media, how could Roosevelt Brown be number 2? And I say, think of Jonathan Ogden, who is probably of this era, one of the premier left tackles. Well, Roosevelt Brown was that as the first of its kind.
Right. Right. And that's kind of to my point. In the era that Roosevelt played, or Rosie, as I knew him, the era that he played, he was the man, and you can't not acknowledge that. I mean, when you're looking at an all-time, team 100 list, certainly he's got to be on it. But it doesn't surprise me at all that he was the number 2 vote getter because he was that good when he played, and that's the concept, and that's a challenge for selectors who I never saw a bulk of his work. I saw it in film. I saw it in through the eyes of others. But I can tell you that through those eyes of others, he was every bit as good as anybody that ever played the game. So, it didn't surprise me at all.
Another name who's an American hero, and I know is near and dear to your heart because he's the first African American player to be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame and still leads the Giants in interceptions. Emlyn Tunnell is bigger than just the New York Giants when you look at his significance.
Yeah, no question about it. You alluded to his military career. I mean, he literally was a guy that tried enlisting. They kept turning him down until he got into the Coast Guard, and then distinguished himself as a war hero, literally. But it was one of those guys. He was a pioneer in so many different ways. As an African American playing pro football, that alone, put him on a pedestal in my eyes because of the barriers that he had to break every week. And it wasn't just, I always get a chuckle out of somebody. They say, Marion Motley, Bill Willis, Woody Strode, and Kenny Washington broke the color barrier. Well, they broke the color barrier, but man, oh man, it existed for many years after that. They just opened the door. And there were the guys that played in 1947, 48, 49, 50 that went through exactly the same things that those four pioneers went through, but not with as much historical recognition. So you look at Emlyn, and he falls right into that category of being an outstanding player in a game where I'm sure there were a lot of headhunters out there, looking for him.
Yeah, and you make a great point too, Joe. Once the barrier is broken, it's not as if everyone goes, "Okay, this is great. The barrier's been broken." It went on. I mean, what they endured, and we learned about it in the Jackie Robinson movie about the enduring. But
Sure.
all of these NFL players had to endure it for years.
Yeah. Yeah. And you think about preparing for a game, you know, he had to prepare for a game in many different ways. He had to prepare for that unfair treatment that he was going to get from opposing players. It was accepted, and it was his teammates that would come to his rescue more often than not. But you had to look at the game officials even. Marion Motley actually remembered the name of the official, the first official to ever throw a penalty flag for unsportsmanlike conduct when a player was trying to purposely hurt him. That meant that much to him, that he had to have his head on a swivel on every play, that he remembered the game official's name, Tommy Hewitt. I remember it now that Marion told me it. But that is such a statement in and of itself.
I want to ask you about Ray Flaherty because he's been in the news lately as the Giants unretired his number for Malik Neighbors. This guy was a great player. Again, it comes in a different era, and the first player in the history of professional football to ever have his number retired.
Yeah, and that's kind of a funny thing, maybe he started something we wished he'd never done because it's become such an issue with unretiring numbers as some other teams have faced before too. But yeah, Ray was one of those guys, was not only a great player, but he goes so far back again that none of us could say we ever saw him play. We had to rely on, the words and the eyes of others. But he was also a good coach. That was the other part of his story. We had more complete packages back in the day when they were playing two ways and then went on to coach. You just transition right out of off the playing field into coaching. And some of them were actually player coaches. So there's this package of work that they have that you wouldn't be discussing today in any way, shape.
Yeah, another guy that kind of fits in that early stages of the NFL is Ken Strong, right?
Sure.
Ken Strong, Mel Hein, Iron Man.
Mel Hein was forever, if they talked about an all-time center, right up into the 70s and 80s, he was still the guy, it was like he was that and made that much of an impression on those that did see him play. And I got to know Mel a little bit, and he was a monster of a man, but you could just tell he was just 100% football. He stayed in it in an administrative role. He was director of officiating in the American Football League for a while, as a matter of fact. But Mel was a perfect example of the double curse of a player who played both ways, but he played center, he played, alignment, that they don't get a lot of recognition today. But in the day when he was playing center and, playing his alignment, it was a running game, really. Let's remember that. So it was, I don't want to say it was more important than it was in the passing game as it evolved, but he got more recognition for it. That, you followed guys like him a little bit more closely, and he dominated so much that he capitalized on that fame and made every all league honor that I think you could have as a lineman.
It's interesting because I'm probably too young to remember that, but I don't remember um, in the early 70s people still using Mel Hein as the standard bearer. I just, I was too young at the time to understand it. But when you think about it, it's 50 years removed from when he played, and he was still considered the standard bearer for center play in the league.
Yeah, and it's funny because the guy that kind of started to replace him was the last of the two-way players was Chuck Bednarik, as a center linebacker. And Chuck had more notoriety, if you can believe it, than Mel, because Mel played in an earlier era when the game was still growing. But there were few, if any, that ever challenged Mel for the premier role that he played.
I want to ask you about because this was one of the names that I insisted be put on the list. And we all know about Jim Lee Howell's staff with the Giants. His offensive coordinator was Vince Lombardi. His defensive coordinator was Tom Landry. And Tom Landry and the Hat and the Dallas Cowboys and the excellence that he did there as a coach. But his credentials as a player, when you look at his credentials as a player, as a New York Giant, I think he's still fourth all time in interceptions or whatever for the franchise. But he really was a player that whose playing career got overshadowed by his greatness as a coach.
Yeah. You're talking Landry, right?
Tom Landry, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Landry was a coach when he was a player. That was the other thing. He was a player coach. So he was a guy that was just so akin to the game, the umbrella defense that they developed that he was a part of. I think, I actually was interviewed a couple of weeks ago with somebody from the AP talking about players transitioning into coaching. And I was saying how, oftentimes some of the greatest coaches were not as good of players as they were coaches. And Landry came close to being both because he was a real meticulous player. He was a student of the game, and that's what made him a great coach. But it was also what made him a leader on the field. So I'd say that his playing credential was just as strong as anybody at that position at the time.
I look at this list, the Benny Friedmans of the world, the Red Bagros of the world, the Ray Flahertys of the world. These are all guys that not only are they important in Giants history, but important in NFL history because these are part of the bedrock of what has made the National Football League what it is today. Arnie Weinmeister's another.
Yeah, Benny Friedman's a perfect example of a pioneer. I mean, he was throwing the ball when the game was, they had rules to discourage you from throwing the ball. An incomplete pass in the end zone, you turn the ball over. Things, rules like that. But he was a pure first. I don't want to call him pure passer, but he was the first to really capitalize on throwing the ball, and he had the confidence to do it. He was a great player, and others then after him, Sammy Baugh really became the next guy that really distinguished himself as a passer. So Benny was an absolute pioneer. And I also think that his recognition in terms of the Hall of Fame and just in general he was Jewish, and there was a bias. And I talked to him on a number of occasions where he felt very strongly about it. And I can't argue against that. So I hope that didn't have a lot to do with his not getting into the Hall until he did, because I feel that a lot of players like Benny fall through the cracks again because the selectors never saw him play. His career was over long before the Hall of Fame was open. But Benny was absolutely a pioneer. Red Bagro the same way. He was an end, which we think of in terms of catching the ball. Well, that was part of his job, and he excelled at that at an early stage because he had guys with the Giants that would throw the ball. But he was also a great blocker on offense and a defensive end. So, when people look at Red and they say, gee, I never even heard of the guy. Well, it was kind of the evolution of the position that was happening at the same time, but he was excelling at the earlier way it was played.
Joe, I want to thank you for taking a couple minutes here to spend time with us and talk about these pioneers, really building blocks of the NFL. And not just that, but the Pro Football Hall of Fame, when the Giants had their Night of Legends at Madison Square Garden, all the Hall of Fame busts were shipped to New York City, to Madison Square Garden, which made it special for all the fans there that night. A really cool move by the Hall of Fame.
Appreciate that, and we loved doing it. It's one of the legacy franchises. I'll take another time. We'll get on with you and talk about that 1925 Red Grange game in New York and how important that was.
Well, let's talk about it right now. We got a few more minutes. Let's talk about it. Well, we don't want to leave him hanging when we're talking 100 years.
All right. Well, that to me, for those that aren't familiar with it, Red Grange was the biggest name in college football in 1925, playing at Illinois. And he turned pro right after the end of his playing season, which was unheard of. I mean, the amateur coaches were up in arms that he turned pro in the first place, but they're saying he was still in school, and they're saying, well, his eligibility was up. Why can't he go? Anyway, long story short, he signs with the Chicago Bears to finish the 1925 NFL season, starting with a Thanksgiving Day game in Chicago where the Bears played the Cardinals, Chicago Cardinals, to a sellout crowd, which was almost unheard of in the NFL at the time, 36,000. But the big game was, now they went out on a barnstorming tour at the end of that regular season. Uh, Red Grange had a manager named C.C. Pyle, Cash and Carry Pyle. He was really kind of the first player agent. He joined up with Hallis and Hallis's partner Dutch Sterneman to go on a barnstorming tour with the Chicago Bears, played against these teams across the country, these mostly pickup teams all across the country. And Pyle literally paid the Bears as his to be his team to be playing in these games, and had Grange into a personal services contract. And that when the Bears during the regular season were finishing out their season, they played a game in New York against the Giants in the Polo Grounds, and it was at a time when Tim Mara rather was on the cusp of packing it in, didn't see the future of the game, and was buried in red ink. Well, when roughly 70,000 people showed up to see Red Grange and a monstrous media turnout, international media coverage on the game, he realized we've got something here, and stayed the course. And of course, they became the signature franchise in the NFL thereafter. But that game, which the Giants lost, was the best thing that ever happened to the Giants. It proved that pro football was here to stay. They had a big name star. It opened the gates to other stars to follow, but it went on to that barnstorming tour, exposing fans across the country. They went down the East Coast and up the West Coast, playing in cities that had never seen pro football. So it opened up the game of pro football, and the only revenue in those days was the gate. So when Red Grange is selling out stadiums, that showed that if you get enough star power, you get enough promotion, you have a quality team and quality play, fans will come. And to me, that was the most important game, that New York Giants game, because it was so heavily covered by the media.
So instead of the Giants being one and done, they're on to season 100. Perfect way to end it.
Perfect.
Joe, thank you so much for all of your hard work and being part of this Blue Ribbon panel. We appreciate it so much, as always. And thanks for joining us on this edition of Papa's Perspective.
My pleasure, Bob.
Joe Horrigan of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Papa's Perspective, brought to you by Bob's Discount Furniture, the official furniture store and a mattress partner of the New York Giants. Countdown to 100 seasons, and one of the 13 members of the voting panel that was so generous to dedicate his time to the cause as a super fan is the longtime PR man for the Mets and now the vice president of alumni relations. He's got his own podcast, Amazing Conversations, Jay Horwitz. Jay, thank you so much for joining us.
My honor, Bob. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, my friend.
Jay, when you think about the 100 seasons and then being asked to be part of this Blue Ribbon panel, what were some of the things that went through your mind as you started to reflect on your time as a Giants fan?
I've had season tickets since 1958. My first game was in '56 when we beat the Bears 47-7. I had season the Yankees stayed behind a pole. I can remember Alan the Horse and Michi running right towards me in the overtime game. Bob, I was a big fan in high school. I wrote a poem. Let me give the first verse of my poem. This is about a long time ago. The quarterback was Tittle by YA by name. He used his passing to gather him fame. What do you think of that?
Pretty good. Nice.
Can't believe after all these years I remember it.
There's certain things you never forget.
I remember Tittle's 7 touchdown passes, been to all the Super Bowls. I remember Eric Barnes on one play. I think he caught a pass for 50 yards in the game. I was a equipment manager special, so I broke my hand at the Herm Edwards game. I broke my hand, my radio, and my binoculars on one play.
Yeah. That's a little different than a sack, force fumble, and a return for a touchdown.
Well, it was the same kind of thing, but a lot of good memories. A lot of good memories.
Jay, as we went about this process with you guys as the voters, the 13 members, I decided to break it down into groups of 25. So we did the top 25, and every position that a player came in got a point value. At the end of the day, we did not subjectively then talk about where people fell in. We let the vote fall where the vote was, just like you would do in Hall of Fame voting. How difficult was it for you to sort of differentiate between the different generations and the different eras when you were casting your votes?
It really, I had the first 25, 40 were pretty much a given. The order was, juxtaposed, but I try to take care of my childhood heroes. I got to the mid 50s, Homer Jones, Jimmy Patton, Dick Lynch, uh, Rosie Greer, Cat Cabbage, Harlan's Farmer. I try not to forget the people I was identified with the youth, and when I try to work them in my could, like I say, the I think my first 20, 30 were, well, I don't think it probably wasn't much differential, but it got to the mid 50s. That's where it started to, to get hard. I didn't want to forget about Greg Gloss and Bookie Bowl and Darrell Des, the guys that I remember as a kid. It was just hard, and really, I probably could have gone to 150, and then we added stuff in the middle. I guess some stuff wasn't on. We added some guys which I forgot about. With just so many guys, at the end, I just hoped that I remembered everybody I should have take care of the guys should be taken care of. I think it was a pretty good list, though, Bob.
Yeah, I thought it came out great. I thought that the voters did a really good job of paying homage to players that played not only in the 60s and the 50s,
Right.
but when you think about some of those players that played in the 20s and 30s and 40s, if you're in one of the original Hall of Fame classes, or, you're a Hall of Famer, obviously that means something. And I thought the voters like you did a really nice job of sort of paying attention to those details and not getting age biased.
Yeah.
Um, as someone that understands the history of the Mets, as you do, with all the years that you worked for the Mets and now as the vice president of alumni relations, you know how important it is for the fans, right? That connection to the past. When you think about your Giant fandom, what are some of the things that really stand out that are tenets for you that are so important?
Well, guys like Frank Gifford coming back to play after he retired, seeing Charlie Connolly at his age do what he did, guys like Del Schaffner and, what they did. I remember I was in Pasadena when Sims went 22 or 25. I remember I was at in Tampa when they lined up, when Norwood lined up for the kick. I went with a friend of mine. I said, no matter what happens, if he misses a kick, we had a great season. I couldn't see it where I was sitting. I remember going to Denny's after the game and having a good time, but just being there for the friendships. I didn't know. I don't know a whole lot of Giants. I got to know Shaw Landetta pretty well. Bill Parcells used to come to our spring training in Florida. Gigantic, baseball fan. He knew that he could recite the '54 Giants baseball team by heart. So some of the memories I was able to gather, and in my friendship with Pat Hamlin is a gigantic, Mets fan, and I'm a gigantic Giant fan, so we kind of bond in and on the seasons.
It's funny that you mentioned that because, a lot of people associate the Giants, the Yankees, the Knicks, the Rangers, right? The four oldest teams in New York. But the amount of Met fans that are Giants fans is very tangible. Talk a
Yeah,
little bit about that.
my father was a diehard Giant fan. He went to the Polo Grounds, and I started going, right from the '50s on. And again, even when I worked with the Mets, there are very few Giant fans in the building, City Field, mostly Jet fans. But I, stuck to my guns, and it's just been just a lot of great memories, through the years. My dad, he saw Tuffy Lehman's play, and who went to George? Ken Strong went to George Washington High School, where my mother went to. So just like that, it kept our family together. My mom was a big fan. I remember going to the '63 game. I think we lost 16-7, and Jim Collier, we blocked a punt, and he scored a touchdown in the end zone. And I remember those years. I think we lost to the Packers the next year. I remember Y.A. Tittle's bloody face in the Daily News when we lost 14-10. So, I kind of matured in my old age, Bob. I don't go crazy like I used to. I haven't broken anything, but I'm still a diehard fan. I've gotten older, so I got to kind of cool down the histrionics. But I still run hard. I can tell you that.
Jay, let's go back to 1986 because 1986, the Mets win their first World Series since 1969. You've got Dwight Gooden, you've got Darryl Strawberry, Keith Hernandez, Gary Carter, Keith Mitchell, Ray Knight. It's an unbelievable team. Dykstra and Backman,
Wow.
and then the pitching staff with Darling and Gooden, and the energy that the Mets brought to this city, and concurrently, your favorite football team
Right.
is doing the same thing. Like that famous Monday night game against Washington, as the Mets are winning the World Series and the Giants are winning a pivotal game. What was it
I
like?
almost got fired because of that, Bob. I'll tell you what happened.
Oh
This
God.
this was game six. Right, I'm forgetting. It was game six. Was postponed one time, and I had the Redskin Giant game on. And my GM at the time, late Frank Cashin, walks by and said, "Jay, which team do you work for? Shut the damn football game off. Put the baseball game on." So I did a podcast with Phil Simms, and he said, "Remember during the game, all of a sudden the crowd burst into cheers and nobody knew what happened. I guess they put it on the scoreboard. I just forget whether it was game six or game seven. It had to be Monday night. It had to be game six, seven, right? I think it's when we won. And
Yeah,
the
I think because of
paper,
the rain delay, right? I
yeah,
think yeah,
rain
because
delay.
yeah, because
And then
wasn't the Mookie Wilson game the Saturday night and then Sunday
yeah,
got
and
rained
the, and
out?
the, and the next day was Rosh Hashanah, that's another long story. My Rabbi got mad because I worked that day, but yeah, they was postponed, and I was watching the Giant game in the middle of game six, or game seven, and my kid was I got to keep my loyalty straight. I said, "Well, Frank, I rooted for the Giants longer than I rooted for Mets. So I think I'm entitled to have the game on." Wasn't too happy with me though.
Yeah, but it was if you think about some of the biggest stars, right, in New York at that time, sports stars, you had the players on your team, and then you had Lawrence Taylor and that giant defense. It was a pretty special time in New York, wasn't it?
It was, and I did a podcast. Harry Carson was nice to do podcasts with me, and he had a Mets jersey on. It really chilled me to the bone. It was an exciting time. I mean, I guess a lot of the guys were friendly. I remember Darryl told me he did a lot of card shows with LT, and Dwight is actually doing something with Lawrence Taylor this week. So there's a lot of bonding, and it was we just had a really exciting group of guys on the team. And when I came to work, and I mean, it always been happening on the back pages, it kept me busy. I tell you that. We the Giants and the Mets was a pretty exciting time in New York.
When the Giants wound up going on to win the World Series, they hadn't won a championship. They had a bunch of near misses in the 50s and early 60s, but they hadn't won a championship since 1956. And, there was a long time for Giants fans, me included as a kid, where you felt like Super Bowls were for other teams. Like we
Right.
were in a separate league. What was it like as that team won a Super Bowl? Did you ever think you'd see one happen?
I went through the Goodbye Alley stuff, the planes flight overhead, George Young coming on, and I can tell you honestly, Bob, I never ever booed at a game. Never once booed. I used to root, I go back to Glenn Griffey and Ralph Guillermo. I got to the time in the '70s, even Parcells, first year, 3-12. I just never saw, but the team was so good. Was that the 14-2 year, the first year,
Yeah.
at '86? They were so good that year. But you go into a one-game playoff like in the playoffs now, anything can happen. But there were so many good players, and Sims was so good, and Joe Mars was so good, and I honestly, I would have ruined no matter what. But honestly, I didn't. I just didn't think it would come. But Phil was so great in Pasadena. Something I'll never remember. I still can remember 22-25 to this day.
Obviously, you moved to the Coughlin era, and they built their own special run, starting with Eli coming in 2004, playoffs in '05 and
Yeah.
'06, and then that amazing Super Bowl run. And a lot of people will say the '08 team was the best team of them all, although they didn't win the Super Bowl. But what was it like, sort of re-energizing yourself as a fan as this new era of Giants came into four and started
Yeah.
becoming regulars in the playoffs, and obviously Eli winning the two Super Bowls?
Yeah. Probably one of the great trades in any sports history. Eli Manning for Philip Rivers. Uh, just I love the way Conklin coach. He's a tough guy, but I guess he made some adjustments later on. But just seeing all the good players, the Strahans and the Justin Tucks, and I remember I was in Phoenix when Burris caused a pass right in front of me in the other end zone. And then the next time, Man and him caught the ball along the sidelines, when I still remember everybody talks about, it's David Tyree's catch, but I still to this day, don't know how, Eli escaped that tackle and was able to get the ball around. I mean, it was, I just remember singular play. I don't remember maybe what I had for breakfast yesterday, but I can remember what happened 40 years ago in plays. But it was just, thanks to my parents, Giants became a staple of my life. It was more than just a game. It was just can't wait for Sundays. Used to, Chris Schenkel, Al DeRogatis, the whole bit. And I've been hooked since a long time ago, and hopefully this will be a different kind of year for us.
Jay, just kind of in wrapping up, as you look at this list, over 5,000 men have worn a Giants uniform since 1925. A whole bunch of Hall of Famers, all-time great Giants players. When you look at the totality of this 100, what's the first thought that comes to your mind?
Uh, Pros, they didn't play the game the right way. You know, they were clutch players, played the game the right way, and they didn't take time off. They didn't, miss time because of injuries. I remember Gifford always get killed on the field. Just the way they approached the game, the professionalism with the coaches, with Coach Coughlin and Coach Parcells. Just the way they played the game, and even when times were dark as it came up and won, like the Freeze Bowl in Green Bay, the Lawrence Tynes kicks, they always came up with the big plays. That's why I bet you every guy in that list had one big play during his career. That's I think that really encapsulates what those 100 guys were about.
Jay, we appreciate you spending a little time with us. I want to thank you again for being
My
part of that Blue Ribbon panel, and enjoy this 100 season.
It's a pleasure to be involved, Bob. I hope to see you at the stadium sometime soon.
We will. That's Jay Horwitz, one of the voters, one of the 13 Blue Ribbon panel voters, longtime PR man with the New York Mets, now the VP of Alumni Relations, joining us on this edition of Papa's Perspective, brought to you by Bob's Discount Furniture, the official furniture store and a mattress partner of the New York Giants.